to reflect on what they hear, Andrew Peggs, who is the Deputy General Secretary of Prospect, which as a journalist I have to refer to as the white collar trade union, but Andrew will expand and clarify and improve on that. And also Sheila Nichol, who is Head of Public Policy at Schroders, which when I was a teenage scribbler, I used to call a merchant bank. I probably now have to call it an investment bank. Anyway, distinguished and venerable. But no, I'm going to be correct.
An asset manager.
Asset manager. Okay, well, even better. Thank you, Sheila. But also, you may know Sheila as a lay canon at St Paul's Cathedral, among other roles in both the Church of England and also the Church of Scotland. Paul Bickley and Barbara have been working on this paper for some time. Some of you will have attended the excellent discussions and panels to help develop the thinking behind the writing of the paper, but there's a lot more in it and new stuff that didn't come up in the meeting, so really is worth reading. We'll hear from them for about 20 minutes or so, some responses from our other two panelists. That will probably take us up to the top of the hour, at which point there will be half an hour or so to take questions from all of you. So start composing them in your head, and then you can put them in the chat room. I may be able to actually invite you to read out your question yourself if we can unmute in the right way and master the technology, which after a year or so of these sorts of things might be possible, but let's not get overexcited. Anyway, Paul and Barbara, let me hand over to you now. I don't know if you've picked on an order of speaking or whether one of you wants to lead off and so on, and we'll listen to you for about 20 minutes or so.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you for agreeing to chair our meeting today and for your contribution to the roundtables. My name is Paul. I'm one of the co-authors of the report and a research fellow at Theos. Just before I start, I just want to thank our supporters in terms of financial support for this project, both those that are anonymous and wish to remain so, and also CCLA Investment Management, who have supported us to do this work. So thank you very much to them. So one of the good things to come out of this pandemic, and I will share some slides in a minute if the host will give me permission, is that we are beginning to have a different kind of public conversation about the importance of work. And you might want to say, well, what are you talking about, Paul? We're always talking about work. We're always tracking employment figures and GDP and the performance of stock markets. Well, I would say yes to that, but it seems to me that there has been a shift in the conversation from the quantity of work to the nature and the quality of work. So from where the question of where unemployment is heading in terms of trends to the question of what kinds of work we value highly and why. The conversation we're having now is about the balance between work and our deeper obligations to family and community, and the kinds of work that will be open to future generations. So it just feels to me like we've shifted into a different space in terms of the public conversation. These deeper issues are in fact usually not well explored in the news media. They're usually explored elsewhere. Think of that kind of almost an entire genre of comedy which is based around the workplace. Probably the most famous one being The Office, which is a comedy that's based in a kind of non-specific work environment. Everyone is someone generic. There's no specificity around their roles or what they actually do. The workplace itself is placeless. It's kind of beige. It's full of artificial lights. There's no windows you can place. It could almost be anywhere, although we do know it's in Slough. And I think that spoke about a crisis in meaning around work, where everything just seems to have an air of pointlessness. But then you can compare it to others within the genre. I wonder if anybody's been watching Superstore, which is a NBC comedy. So from the States, this is a very different beast. The job here is something very specific, and so is the social commentary. It's a so-called big box store, like a big retail store in a flyover state, and the kind of horizon, the kind of economic horizon is one of fierce competition with online retail, where work conditions are being squeezed to the point of actively being inhumane to the workers. I recommend catching up on that on Netflix if you have the chance. But not all of this can be made a joke, of course. Think of Oscar-winning films like Nomadland or Ken Loach's Sorry We Missed You, where a man takes a job as a delivery driver, or should I say he agrees to work in one of those kind of bogus self-employment scenarios. He agrees to work with a delivery company, but he and his wife trapped in a vicious cycle of low pay and no pay, and they're trying to deliver on their caring responsibilities to children and elderly parents. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the workplace, or our work, is often the context in which our lives are lived, like in their fullness. And I think we should be asking the question: what kind of workplace sitcom will we be watching in 20 or 30 years' time? What's the next Oscar-winning film, and what kind of issues will it have to cover? In our report, we talk about 3 different waves of change or disruption: the technological, the ecological, and the anthropological. Basically, those are to do with, as you would guess, technology, environment, and the fact that our work is conditioned by the fact that it's human beings that do it. So when it comes to the technological, consider that 10%, according to one reliable estimate, of jobs in the UK labour market are at high risk of automation. 25% of jobs are likely to change at least to some degree. That's from a 2016 paper for the OECD. The rates are much higher in lower skilled and lower paid work. 32% of people in the lowest income decile are working in jobs that are likely to be automated in the near future. If it's not workplace automation, then it might be some kind of workplace surveillance. We're seeing an increasing role of that in our workplaces. TeamViewer, as my colleague Pete pointed out to me the other day, is now the shirt sponsor for Manchester United, which puts them alongside Aon, AIG, Vodafone, and Sharp Electronics and Chevrolet, these kind of corporate giants, as a shirt sponsor for Manchester United, but they are essentially a supplier of remote working software. So that's the technological wave. When it comes to the environmental wave, 1.2 billion jobs in the world. That's 1.2 billion, according to an ILO, International Labour Organization estimate. And that's 40% of global employment is in industries which depend heavily on natural processes. Just before we swung open the doors to our guests today, we were talking about the weather in the Northwest United States. One very sad story to emerge from that was of a farm worker, Sebastian Francisco Perez, a 38-year-old from Guatemala, who happened to be working on a tree farm in rural St. Paul in Oregon. And on the 26th of June this year, collapsed and died because of the heat conditions. The US state of Oregon adopted emergency rules the week after to strengthen requirements for employees to protect workers and safeguard workers from those conditions. So it's worth remembering that for most people in the world, and even probably a majority of people in the UK, work isn't really a matter of shall I go to the office or shall I work from home? It takes place in a wider environment, and those wider environments will be affected by climate change. Even in 2020, the ONS tells us that I think it's 35.9% of the workforce did some work at home. That's some, not even working exclusively at home. So the figures there are not as high as you might imagine. Lots of people are out there in the kind of concrete world where the sun shines and the rain rains and all of those kind of things, and they will be affected by changes in the climate. And then finally, the anthropological kind of disruption. And by the way, it's worth saying that these aren't all necessarily going to make work worse. They're just our factors and contexts in which we need to understand how it's changing. The anthropological problem is the fact that work is done by human beings. The pandemic has demonstrated how vulnerable that means we are. The whole global economy derailed by a respiratory virus. We could also look at things like fertility rates, which will matter hugely within decades in terms of the labour market. The global fertility rate at this moment in time is about 2.4. By comparison, in the 1960s, there was a global average of 5 live births per woman. So in the last 5 decades, the fertility rate has halved. And while the global fertility rate is still above that kind of replacement level, which I think is technically 2.1 children per woman, by 2017, about half of all countries had already fallen below that. And that's a significant number of economies. In time, that's going to require a significant policy response. And in the countries with low fertility rates, places like Singapore, it already has. So this might sound like a lurid set of comments, but this is coming down the tracks and will be very real very soon. So that's the context. We started this piece of work before the pandemic hit. We wanted to bring together the growing conversation about the kind of quality and the future of work and the history of thinking and practice within the churches and within the kind of theological traditions of those churches around this theme of work. For instance, this September seems the 40th anniversary of the publication of a papal encyclical on work by John Paul II, Laborem Excrescens, really notable document in that it endorses the priority of labour over capital, which CST up to that point had not really done, but it kind of goes full throttle for the priority of labour over capital. And I suppose our question is, what happens when you bring those resources and you use them to address the framework or address rather the challenges that I was just talking about? And from a theological point of view, I'll limit my comments to just a very few. But it seems to me that what the Christian tradition does is set up a tension between a very high ideal for work, but then a kind of pragmatic realization that for most people, they experience nothing like that ideal. So work is a human good. Humans are, from a kind of theological point of view, created for work, and not just for the purposes of providing through that work. It's part of their response to creation and creator. Work connects us to prosperity, to kind of collective prosperity. It connects us to other people. It yields a sense of purpose. So when we think about some of the contemporary debates around even something like the kind of post-work sentiment that's emerging, one of the questions I think that Christian theology would pose to that is not the question of how do we provide for people in a kind of post-work environment, but how do we ensure that we recognize the threefold significance, not just of that connection to prosperity, but also that connection to other people and that connection to a sense of meaning and purpose, so that people will feel like they're contributing to a common good. So that's the ideal. I think the Christian tradition has also traditionally kind of just recognized through the sheer kind of facts of life that most people experience work as toil. And in the Genesis account, of course, there's this very evocative kind of curse that's pronounced over work: through painful toil you will eat of the ground all the days of your life, or something like that. And I think from the point of view of the Christian tradition and its long reflection on work, that unfolds on a personal but also a systematic level, so that we see that there's injustice and distortion in the economy. And the question that I think Christian reflection on work tries to do is resolve that question. So what do you do if you want to claim that work is our way of connecting to shared prosperity? But in the UK at the minute, I think according to the latest figures from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, about 15% of adults in working families are in poverty. There's something not working there. And equally on the more existential front, the kind of meaning and purpose end of the conversation, we know that most people experience often a sense of disconnect from their work. We did some polling as part of this project. 33% of people in that poll in England and Wales supported the statement, work is just a way to provide for life's necessities. That's not a kind of large proportion, but it was the most supported statement. By comparison, only 10% agreed with the statement that my current work is part of my calling and vocation. So 90% of respondents didn't feel that their work was part of their calling and vocation. Excuse me. So what does the Christian tradition wants to do? It wants to begin to resolve these questions. And in the language of Catholic social teaching, it wants to humanize work, which is a big part of what our report's about. And I'll hand over to Barbara.
And the problem is, over the last 40 years, we haven't been very successful at humanizing work. Workers have been largely on the losing end of our economy for several reasons. Many jobs moved overseas. There was a rise in precarious work with unstable hours, no benefits, and often no contracts. Effectively, almost a return to the home piecework we knew a couple of centuries ago with apps like TaskRabbit and Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And in addition, there's been a declining bargaining power of unions, which has played a significant role. So what we've experienced is a hollowing out of the middle, where there are good, professional, head jobs, as Goodhart would refer to them, and poorly paid jobs in caring, delivery, and the gig economy, and a real paucity of jobs in the middle, what once might have been either in manufacturing or craft or service provision. So if we are to humanize work and experience the community, sense of purpose, and belonging that can come from it, we need to re-begin to mix people of different skills and backgrounds in the workplace. However, much more important than that is that the baseline conditions on living wages, living hours, and fair benefits and social charges for all workers are also a prerequisite, because you can't do anything until you get to this baseline level. And frankly, this is likely to require legislation. This is not going to be something that happens voluntarily. But it can also be pushed through a better balance of stakeholder benefits in business. That is a split of benefits between business owners, employees, customers, and suppliers. And I believe a first step in this direction would be clear investor and notably church investor emphasis on these issues and others within the S of the social in ESG, or environmental, social, and governance responsible investing. However, real positive change would involve more than just a leveling up of baseline conditions. Humanizing work would put the emphasis on enabling human flourishing. This occurs both through improving people's voice and agency at work, and frankly, by actively limiting work. So in order to enable people to feel they are getting more out of work, what could happen? First of all, I think employers and employees would agree that there's a real need for lifelong learning and training, enabling people to continue to develop skills to meet evolving employment needs throughout their careers and their lifetimes. Now, in our report, we say this should be largely employer funded, as they have the most to benefit from the upskilling. Currently, some of you who know this will know that it's the proposal before government is actually that it should be borrowing by the employee that covers this, which is a real problem for people who need to reskill late in life, because they will never get enough of the benefits from this to warrant the reskilling. We also believe in a commitment to the Living Hours Project of the Living Wage Foundation. This asks companies to agree to a minimum 4 weeks notice of work schedules with guaranteed payment if shifts are canceled within the notice period, and a right to contract that reflects accurately the hours worked with a guaranteed minimum of 16 hours a week on all employment contracts unless the worker requests otherwise. This means people would have more certainty and control over their work time and their ability to, for example, to get child care provision or elder care provision. We also would like to see technology used to improve work. It could take out the drudgery of many tasks, and it could help to lift heavy loads, which is my personal favorite as I'm getting older, rather than be used for embedded surveillance on workers or an ability to work 24/7. There are real tech for good, and there's actually an institution called Tech for Good, thoughts that are working on these issues, and we need to do more for those. And last of all, in this category, better work would give greater voice to workers, both through unions and employer-employee engagement about how they want to work. And some of this we've already seen largely among white-collar workers in the somewhat post-pandemic era, as people are surveying their employees on how they want to work in future and the mix of work from home, work in office they want. In our case, we believe this would also include the increased use of flexible working, as that would permit most people to incorporate more non-work activities in their everyday life. But we also need to limit work and its intrusion into our lives. Technology permits us to be always on, and employers increasingly watch what we are doing everywhere and all the time, with surveillance cameras, apps that count keystrokes, and even Fitbits that tell our employers and their insurers about our health. Moreover, many poorly paid self-employed need to be always on in their gig jobs or risk losing work or their position. Or they need to be always worried about where the next gig might come from in order to get more hours in order to make ends meet. Not only is this bad for the worker, it is bad for our common lives, our communities, and our families. But it need not be inevitable. We need to bring back the concept of a limit to work, a period to rest, and a time to disconnect. We think we can do this in a variety of ways. We can strive to require employers to pay overtime and make it explicit. In so doing, it will actually encourage them to hire more staff so that they don't pay the multiples that are due to overtime. We'd like to see employer surveillance when out of hours stop, and ideally all employer surveillance stop. And we would include encouraging a right to disconnect so that you are not always on. We also would like to see statutory time in contracts for voluntary activities, so they're no longer the 1 day a year of time given by many employers, but the employee is allowed to pick where they work voluntarily and do it consistently so the organization can count on them. And last of all, we believe that the UK should hold more public holidays. We have the lowest number of public holidays in the West, which I hadn't realized until Paul told me so, and I checked. So in securing better basic conditions for work and benefits for a wider sector of the population, we would help resolve in-work poverty. This is the single biggest ask that would support a view of a more equal society in the interest of the common good. Together with our other recommendations, these steps would arrive at what we're calling a full work economy, while at the same time limiting the relative importance of work in our lives, to make room for other ways of finding meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. The outcome would be a rediscovery of family, community, volunteerism, and what are sometimes called third spaces, those places that are neither home nor work. We believe it would also likely result in lower absenteeism through illness, improved mental health, and higher employee productivity, which would benefit employers and employees alike. The biblical idea of a Sabbath is an ancient answer to this very modern anxiety. If we could recover it or find new shared practices of rest, we would help tackle overwork of people and at the same time do something to help limit the exploitation of our natural environment. Thank you, and back to Stephanie.
Barbara and Paul, thank you so much for bringing the theoretical and the practical together, just as you brought the theological and the secular together. You reminded me of a line that Tony Benn came up with many, many years ago when he declared that the wages of sin are death and the wages on the railway are a good deal worse. And I think that's the tension that you've kind of reflected on so well and at greater length and very powerfully and convincingly in your wonderful paper that everyone, I'm sure, will be looking forward to reading after we've finished. Sheila, perhaps I can come to you next for some response. You also inhabit, what can I say? You work for both God and Mammon. Can I even put it that way? But you certainly know both these worlds very well. What were your thoughts on hearing Paul and Barbara today?
Thank you very much. Yes, it is possible to do both. I mean, just to say first, thank you very, very much for inviting me to join this panel. And the report is absolutely fascinating, and I've got so many thoughts fizzing through my head that the challenge has actually been getting 2 or 3 coherent reflections to share with you today, because there is so much in it. So thank you. And I also think it's extremely timely, because I think we are in a period of inflection in the corporate world, not just because of the pandemic. And it's interesting, the initials ESG have already been used several times. And probably 2 years ago, maybe even 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago, I had never heard those 3 letters used together. And now I am using them almost every hour in thinking. I mean, okay, I'm in the world of investment, but also in my volunteering at St. Paul's, at the Church's Mutual Credit Union, everywhere I am, I seem to be talking about ESG and sustainability. Interestingly enough, I mean, I take Barbara's point about the fact that actually an awful lot of the focus has been on E recently, and if anything, it's only on part of the E, it's on the climate change bit of E. In Schroders, I am in the regulatory world, so I talk to regulators, I talk to policymakers, both in the UK and in Europe, and the focus has been very much on climate change. I mean, interestingly, I would suggest that if anyone has been pushing for the S to be seen to be part of this as well, in fact, the E, the S, and the G to be all taken together, it is actually the investor world. Because I think, you know, the E, the S, and the G are seen as being mutually supportive, not as different. If you're good at one, you're more likely to be good at the others. In this world, so they're sort of mutually reinforcing. I think the other important debate that's happened in the world of ESG is the move from thinking that in order that you have to forego value in order to do good. I think the whole debate around ESG and in the investment world is actually that is not the case anymore. That actually, if you are good at E, S, and G, the likelihood is that you have a strong, sustainable business model. And there's far more thinking in the audit world, in the financial world, around forward-looking measures, not just looking at a point in time when it comes to reading the accounts and looking backwards, but actually the importance of looking forward. Our chief executive of Schroders talks about impact-adjusted profits. And I think that's something that is becoming more to the fore in thinking in this world. So I would actually challenge this people versus profits concept. I think actually it's people and profits now, and it is no longer seen to be people versus profits. You need to be good with your people in order to be a more profitable company. Now, I mean, the question then is, you know, I'm fortunate. I know I do work in a company that gets this, and I appreciate that not employers do get it. So I think the challenge then is, how do we help them to get this? How do we persuade them of this? You know, one hopes that it's what's happened in the environmental world is going to seep into other worlds. But I think the report absolutely nails it, and it's actually about culture change within organizations. And it's about establishing trust and respect within the workplace. And I would challenge to say that actually you don't achieve culture change through regulation and legislation. You've got to change mindsets, and you've got to change mindsets by persuading employers, senior management in organizations that this is a good thing to do, and that actually this point about people versus profits is not a dichotomy, it is a mutually supporting concept. So I don't think legislation is necessarily the answer, because if you've got legislation, you'll inevitably say, well, what's the minimum? I work in a highly regulated world, and I have been a regulator myself. That there's a tendency, if you've got regulation, to tick the box. I've done that, to throw it towards the compliance department and say, you just tell me what to do and I'll do it without thinking about it. There's a tendency to sort of just say, how do I mitigate the risk? So I think, actually what we've got to get people to think about is, what are we actually trying to achieve here, rather than how do I comply with ticking the appropriate boxes. So you need to get the hearts and minds. And I think it's about leadership, leading by example. I think it's about persuading them that it makes good economic and business sense. And I also think it's moving away a bit from this us and them, employers versus workers kind of attitude. It is about respect and trust, and actually giving workers or giving employees the freedom to be trusted, but that actually then requires a response from those employees to earn that trust as well. So I could go into a lot of detail about flexible working, and we can maybe come back to that, but I won't dwell on that for a long time. So I think, for example, ideas of having workers on councils, that sounds to me as a bit old-fashioned, and it's more about communication. It's more about actually using technology to communicate. And interestingly, I think it's about humanizing the CEO. And we've got personal experience of that. Interestingly, as a result of the pandemic, our CEO has started doing monthly or 2 weekly, I think it is, in the height of the pandemic. Now it's more monthly podcasts, which get broadcast across the organization globally. And he said, it's appalling, Sheila. He said this to me, it's appalling, Sheila, that it took a pandemic to make me think of doing this. But he shows his own vulnerabilities. He shows his own humanity. We've had his son playing the clarinet in the background. We've had him talking about ironing duvet covers during the pandemic, as well as telling us about how the business is doing and what our executive committee discussed in its last meeting. So I would say that the thesis is winning hearts and minds and permeating, leading by example. And as a result, of Peter's activities, I'm finding myself showing my own vulnerability. And it is actually leadership showing that they are humans as well. And I think the pandemic has helped in that process, because leaders, the issues may be different. It may be that they're not sitting in a cramped flat with 4 flatmates around them trying to work on a laptop on their bed, but they still have their own vulnerabilities in this context. And therefore, a bit more compassion in the workplace, I think, is actually coming about. So I could talk a lot about flexibility, flexible working. I could talk a lot more about work-life balance and so on, but I'll stop there for the moment.
Sheila, thank you very much for those thoughts from the heart of the city and the soul of the city too, at the same time. I'm going to invite Andrew to respond, and someone will have to take him off. Magic. Seamless, unrehearsed. Technological brilliance. Andrew, please respond to what you've heard so far.
I thought I was almost going to have to start with the usual plea of I couldn't get myself off mute. One of the lessons we thought we'd all done. But look, firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak here. I think it's a tremendous report, and it speaks to a lot of the issues that many of us are thinking across not just the world of work, but the world of civic society. And I've learned a lot from this meeting. Apparently, duvet covers should be ironed. I took a note on, which is something at my age I have not learned until this point. So I'm going to address a few points in response to what I think is an excellent report and contribution. Firstly, a little bit around the role of faith and good work. Secondly, some of the contemporary challenges we learned about during the pandemic and some of the different forms of how that is expressed. And then finally, a teeny bit on workers organising and how we build better for it. And I think all of those fit together into what I see very much of this contest of things between sit around work-life balance, but particularly sit around this idea of this balance between human values and technology. I think that's one of the real interesting debates, and where those two things fit together in coming out of this pandemic in the future world of work. So I'm part of the team at Prospect. In old currency, we're white collar as introduced, but we represent around 150,000 professionals, engineers, specialists, people in technical type roles. For the world of faith, we represent prison chaplaincy service, so chaplains of multi-faiths and have taken cases. Indeed, we won a High Court victory several years ago on equal pay for part-time and non-Christian chaplains, given some of the structural inequality in chaplaincy pay as well. So it's a contemporary issue for us. But I also think this intersection of faith and how I see it being around good and rewarding work is really important. I think we need to talk about it in terms of that human value within the work relationship and what work enables most of us to do. For many of us, or most of us, work will be the biggest relationship we have in our lives outside of family and faith itself, because we have to work. And it will be the feeling of security, the respect we receive at work, the wages or pay we receive will enable us to enact the other rights or issues that define or underpin our lives. And I think that's why economic and social justice go into this, looking at how they play together. In prepping for this, I was reading again, I can't go back, what was it, Paul? 40 years, what anniversary did you cite of the papal encyclical? But I was reading the Pope's comments to the ILO conference last month, where again, the Pope was very clear about the role of collective bargaining and trade unions and freedom of access to organise for workers around the world as underpinning the ability of people to collectivise or understand their economic and social worth. Very similar message actually to which the Archbishop of Canterbury gave 2 years prior to that, when he was the guest speaker at the TUC Congress, again, bringing in and sharing some of those value sets, which I think many of us have in common about human worth in a rapidly changing technological world. So I think, firstly, I welcome it on that. It's a conversation I've been part of, engaged with, and I noticed an old friend is on this call, and I may indulge you all by saying happy birthday to Ian Geary, who has been one of my great challenges on this intersection of faith and good work in there. So sorry if you're embarrassed, Ian, I thought I couldn't work it. So to me, this really is the right conversation. We used to talk early on in this pandemic around build back better and the new normal. I don't think we talk about that as much as we used to, or we talk about it in a very reductive way about, is it about turning the clock back, or is it about a new world of work? Is it the office, or is it working from home? And I think we need something much more expansive in understanding where good and rewarding work fits together. And that's my second point. I think the pandemic has changed things. I think, as Sheila was saying, we were looking at many of these issues around the role of modern work, where that fits in, technology prior to the pandemic, but it's undoubted the inversion of our economic model for many people through remote working, underpinned by technology, has transformed our discussions around these issues around what does, in the old, I often say it in the old way, like the Mars bar, work, rest and play. What is that interaction of work to our ability to rest and play? How has technology worked in that? Undoubtedly, it has kept us safe, connected, and in many instances working during this pandemic, but it's also had another side, which Barbara mentioned around surveillance, the new capacity of technology. We have seen turbo boosters put under this technological change, which means that there is a pressure on us, I think, now to be the people who try and fix this conversation in a way that inserts human values into that. I think the ability of automated decision making, of AI, the power of technology feels something greater than just previous economic changes or models of change. And I think that puts on us an onus around a technology which can make decisions about us without human involvement to understand what that means. And it's not It's not really about robots. It's not really about turning back. It's about the technology and use of data in it. Prospect are good friends with many Swedish colleagues and often look to them around the idea of social partnership they have across the economy. And they have a great phrase there, which actually fits the attitudes of many of our members, which is that workers should not be scared of the new machines. They should be scared of the old ones. This sense that if we try and stop change happening or don't engage with it, ultimately we will end up with fewer jobs because economic markets and investors will go elsewhere. So in all of our surveys and check-ins with our members, people are greatly encouraged by the potential technology has, but there's always a second part to that equation, the but. It must be done well. It must be done with people, and it must respect that human value that shines through in the report that Barbara and Paul pulled together. And I'm not sure that always happens. When we did survey work earlier in this pandemic in April, thinking about what this future looks like, we can talk about how CEOs and others should involve people, but only 1 in 5 people said they'd been consulted about potential future new patterns of work by their employer. And that simply isn't good enough if we are to have a shared economy. When we have asked members, and we've done public polling, asked the public themselves around, do they think technology will transform the work they do? And would they be consulted by it? The vast majority, 75% plus, think they wouldn't be consulted about how technology will change their work and their relationship to it. Equally worrying from our perspective, it's the same figure, 75% of workers say that if that technology came in and they still had a job from it and it led to productivity gains, they did not think they would see any of the benefits of that technological gain. I think that's really worrying for us, because if we think trust and transparency and agency are important concepts and technology is improving the profitability or the effectiveness of organizations, then we need a conversation about how we as workers and employees and freelancers get to share in the benefits of what this new world looks like. And that raises those questions around what we've experienced. I read across not just union work, but across a lot of the research and literature, and I've been taken by the commonality in the findings of it. There was some research Aviva have done. They've done some great research about attitudes of employees for it, which found 44% of workers felt unable to switch off whilst remote working because they felt under pressure from their employer to be always on. Our survey workers Prospect has found 44% of remote and home workers during this period have felt pressure and anxiety or mental health episodes based on that always on culture. And this was here before. The ability of these bits of kit to enable us to constantly stay connected does not mean we have to be. And that value set of how do we make this work? And I think this is a really interesting question for flexible work. We as trade unions, and there are some other trade union colleagues I see on this call, which is great, have talked about the importance of flexible working. But it's not flexible for workers if you are still expected to deliver a workload that goes beyond the boundaries of that work. And that to me is the huge fear. We can talk about the death of the office or the end of presenteeism. What happens if we simply replace old-fashioned presenteeism with a new form of digital presenteeism? And we know that way will lay greater anxiety and mental health issues. That way will also lead greater discrimination, because we know those people who choose to work remotely or from home or with caring responsibilities, the burden of that still falls predominantly on women. And that will see if people are being rewarded or defined as the good worker or bad worker by where they are remotely situated, or whether they're constantly online or responding to employers' demands, risk a new form of a traditional sexism or discrimination in the economy that we need to understand. So I think we need to look at all of these things in the whole, the always on culture. So I'm really pleased to see this concept of disconnect. We have to switch off. The line I always say is, on a Friday night, if you're not working and you're preparing to feed your children around the table and there's a bang on your door and it's your boss who then proceeds to walk into your house, sit at your kitchen table and talk over your children about work demands, we would know that to be clearly inappropriate. If it's inappropriate in person, how do we get to a point where it's inappropriate if employers are invading our private spaces when we are not working? You know, it's not about 9 to 5ism. I think it's about this cultural concept. And Sheila's right. It's about workload. It's about job design. It's about culture. And the manifest of it is technology in that. And that's why we're deeply worried. I'm deeply worried across the movement around the prevalence of surveillance. 1 in 5 British companies are now using digital monitoring or planning to do so off the back of it. And I think we need to talk about, what does that mean in terms of keystrokes and being monitored? What does that mean of cameras coming into my home? What does it mean of the value judgment? If you're a younger worker in shared housing, or you're someone with a family or domestic situation which is not declared to your employer, and frankly, they have no right to know it in some instances. Even with back jobs, you begin to make this changing nature of privacy. What was regarded as a workspace now becomes our private lives by bringing those workstations into that. And I think that needs really careful calibration and reflection. I say it so we can get it right, because I really think I'd like to see an economy based on that flexibility, which is different to home working, so people can balance the different demands and have those choices in it. So surveillance, privacy, that kind of changing remote nature of what's happening really pushes together with this technological drive. It's almost like there's snake oil salespeople out there, Stefan, trying to sell these into companies. And we see this from the likes of Microsoft through to small things. Barbara talked about surveillance software. US siblings in the union movement have monitored or tracked down over 300 different companies offering these things, largely US developed, but also sold into America. Some of them have James Bond-esque, or The Office would be good, type thing, spy agent, staff cop, sneak, all designed to allow micro-invasive management. And I'm not making those up. Those are products sold into the US market. But we're also seeing it with Microsoft as well, who last year introduced what they thought was helpful software in terms of allowing managers to monitor productivity of their home workers and down to individuals. When there was a backlash, they stepped back from it. But it shows how those boundaries are porous in terms of the technology. So Stefan, lots of issues there. I just want to make one final point, if you indulge me around it, which is that I think we just have to be really careful about how we talk about some of this work-life balance stuff. I'm really struck that, for many of our members and many key workers, they've been leaving their homes to help look after us and support us and power us throughout this pandemic. And we sometimes talk about flexible work or home working as though that is the mainstream. And actually, the economy has been much more nuanced than that. And my worry is, when the conversation happens about the death of the office, when it happens in newspapers, it tends to happen from a position of privilege. People in professional jobs who have the ability and the home working conditions or the seniority for that to be a choice. And if you're a younger worker in poor housing, or if you work in facilities, or if you work on a reception, or if you work in a manual-based thing, or even some white-collar roles, you don't have those choices. So I think we just need to be aware of the wider vision of where power relationships lie in the world of work. And when we talk about being able to work anywhere, for most workers, they will not get that choice, because it will be in a facility or office, or anywhere will not mean the south of France or the coffee shop. It will mean their home. And the home is furthest from anywhere you get. It is somewhere private, it is somewhere specific, and it is somewhere based on family. And as we blur the boundary of work and family, work and rest together, we need to hardwire into it the conversations that Theos has started about how do we get those boundaries right. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And that last point, I think, was extremely well made. I'm not sure if anyone has used the word dignity yet, but humanizing work obviously implies, I think, fundamental basic human dignity. I agree with you entirely. I hope you'll never find a piece with my name on it making any jokes about health and safety, for example, because it's far too easy, as you say, for journalists, as we used to be in air-conditioned, comfortable offices, to make sneering comments about regulations that by and large don't affect us in our work, but do affect many other people. Thank you. Now, one thing leapt out at me. I'll take some questions from you now. I think the chat box will start filling up as I speak. But the one thing I wanted to put back to the panel is perhaps particularly for Barbara and Sheila to sort of have a little to and fro on is this question of legislation. I think Barbara was quite clear that some legislation may indeed be necessary. Sheila much more sceptical about it. Now, I absolutely take Sheila's point that we have a tradition in this country of seeking voluntary agreements, partly for the reasons that she set out, that you can actually get much more out of voluntary agreements than minimal, grudging, legalistic compliance with legislation. However, as we know, I just referred to health and safety. We needed legislation to have a national minimum wage, an Equalities Act, a Factories Act, ending child labour. We have needed legislation in the past to stop bad things from happening. And so, Barbara, Sheila, have a little dialogue about the advantages or disadvantages of legislation.
Well, the particularly interesting thing about this is Paul and I have been debating this most of the way through, and I vacillate and I flip-flop from one side to the other, and he's managed to convince me where I think I probably started in Sheila's position, but I actually think it's everybody's responsibility. I don't think it's just any one lever that's going to make a difference. Because if you can't convince businesses it's in their interest, they're going to do this de minimis stuff. So I'm afraid Sheila and I might actually, emphatically agree, Stephen, which is never good for a debate. But they will only do the minimum, and that's not what we want. If you don't get investors telling the companies that it matters to them, then the companies won't do it. And frankly, a lot of it's going to depend on the supply and demand of labor, because one of the reasons that we have done so badly as labor in the last 40 years is specific policies against labor, but also, widespread outsourcing of jobs elsewhere, widespread immigration of cheap labor, and that has made it very easy to keep wages down. One of the things that I think is a positive example is the living wage, which started as a movement, not as a law. And we have minimum wage laws, but a lot of people are actually trying to get everyone to pay the living wage. And in many cases, the London living wage, which is higher than the living wage in the rest of the country. And those kind of movements require consumers to pay a little bit more for their food and their clothing and the things they buy, so that the business benefit isn't all driven to the consumer end or to the owner end, that those benefits are shared. How we do that in what is effectively a liberal economy is very difficult without some legislative push.
Sheila.
At the risk of bringing us together rather than pushing us apart, which was always much more interesting. It's got to be a blend of the two. My problem being that often, we've got this at the moment in the financial services world. The problem that you have is regulation inevitably, that there will be people who just don't get it. And that you just, you have to force to get it. And I fully, I'm not naive enough to think that, everyone will get it. But what that tends to do with regulation is that then it drives it to the lowest common denominator. You regulate to the worst case. Therefore, those who do get it are then just tied up in bureaucracy, evidence gathering, policy writing, and so on. I think the other thing that regulation can do, on the other hand, is not say you must behave in this particular way, but it can create nudges. It can cause people to focus on things that they might not otherwise focus on. So there's been quite a lot of focus, for example, on gender pay gap. And actually what that's done is required more disclosure from corporates around their gender pay. And the expectation was that would lead to external commentary and cause companies to behave in a different way. Actually, what it's done is that it's not the external pressure that comes. It's actually just the fact that the company is forced to think about that. So I think there are frameworks that you can create without saying you must behave in this particular way, you must behave in that way. And that regulation is almost at its best when it's creating a nudge, which then you combine the combination of certain obligations, but you also do require people to think for themselves.
Thank you. Now, we had one question in advance, so I will go to that one first, and it's from Dr. Mark Reed. And Mark, I thank you. I can either read it out for you, or someone might be able to unmute you and you can read your own splendidly drafted question for yourself. I'm looking at that logo in the middle of your screen. Perhaps for speed, shall I just read it out, Mark? Is that all right? And Mark says this: if the aim of work is, or ought to be, to make the world better, how far will this be facilitated by work organizations in a post-COVID world? So a nice, big, broad question. Who wants to? Paul, perhaps you haven't spoken yet.
Well, I think that is a great question. I think that my own instinct is that the boundaries, if anything, ought to be restored. And I think Andrew put it very well in that comment at the end, where if a boss comes around at tea time on a Friday and starts kind of demanding your attention, what would you do about that? You wouldn't give him much attention, I think. So I recognise the premise of the question, which is that for many people, and not all people, there's been this severing of the idea of work and place in specific times, and the kind of pragmatic response to that, I think, is to acknowledge and not pretend that's going to kind of go back into some kind of status quo ante, but to ensure that people treat this kind of new environment well, and that both employees and employers have a kind of healthy and thoughtful approach to it, but also that we do need new ways of creating boundaries and policing boundaries. So when we talk in the report a lot about the idea of kind of Sabbath, which just means stop. It just means there's got to be a stop. So therefore, I think what we want to do is not to kind of create this kind of Sunday day off notion, but to recognise that these boundaries work best when they're shared boundaries. So they're not individuated to an individual employee who has to take the responsibility for themselves, whether to kind of take that time off or to unplug at 5:30, or is it 6 o'clock, or is it 6:30, and so on and so forth. I think what I'm slightly evading the question, but we need shared practices, which is why we kind of resorted to this idea of kind of bank holidays that I would say that might be a bit kind of reductive, but it has the benefit of, like most people get bank holiday. Of course, not all people get to take the day off on a bank holiday, but most people get to take some shared time off. And I think that notion of these things can't just be left to a kind of liberal, either kind of socially liberal or economically liberal, a kind of personal choice approach, but shared social practices of rest and limitation. I would be in favour of kind of reinstituting more boundaries rather than just kind of throwing our hands up and saying, well, it's all out there now. I don't know if that answers your question, but those would be my thoughts.
If I may, Stephen, I have a radical view of this that actually we didn't put in the report, but I was thinking about for something else I was working on, which is that the limited liability corporation isn't a right. It's a gift that comes from government. And we could require, if any government so wished, a purpose for a corporation that was actively to do good before giving them limited liability status. But we don't. But we could. And it's something, it's not original. It wasn't my idea, and I can't honestly admit where I read it. But there are different ways of rethinking what corporations must do before they are granted that liability, that limited liability, which I think is an interesting business route to take.
Very interesting thought. limited liability has been a vital underpinning for corporate activity and risk taking, and yet, rights and responsibilities. Anyone else on the panel want to respond to our first big question?
If you don't mind, Stefan. I think how I reflect on it is actually in the UK we're served by really poor labour market institutions, and our whole sense of how we mediate within the boundaries of work and rest are really poor. So some of these conversations about boundaries would be really different if we were in Germany, if we were in Scandinavia. And it's not about big regulation, and I can see some of the downsides of that if it's done wrong, but actually there's a greater sense of social partnership in the economic model, where there is free collective bargaining and representation. So in this asymmetry of power in the workspace of a contractual relationship, you go to many of those economies which are performing better than the UK in average. They have a much higher level of employee participation in industrial strategy, in how companies are run, in the long-term investment in workforce, in skills and people. And that's part of our problem in this country. We're midway between the US and ourselves. We did research where we plotted out the correlation between those economies which have adopted a higher level of automation and technology and those that have a higher level of employee participation. And there is a clear correlation that those places that involve their workforce in some sense through unions or works councils and others actually have higher productivity on average than we do, and actually are adapting to a new modern economy. And to me, that's the missing ingredient. We don't really talk about the people element in it. And what I find really fascinating is that early on in this crisis that has befell the world, we really turned the dial from the last 25 years of government by virtue of it involved business, unions, and government working together with a sense of social partnership, whether that was in the rapid turnaround to get furlough in place, whether that was in the slightly imperfect self-employment scheme, in actually relying on companies and unions and worker representatives through health and safety to ensure risk assessments were placed. There was a great coming together which led to that sense of, we should have a new normal. And the things we've done better during the crisis as a nation have been those which have shared the characteristics of social partnership. And those things we have done worse, such as some of the changes on the restrictions we have at the moment, have been when they have been done to the social partners. And it's interesting that actually business and unions together have expressed concerns about the way government has done things to us. So to me, that characteristic of how do we get the boundaries right, I think the characteristic of the answer is keeping that social partnership together so that workers have a stake as well as business in getting the long-term answers right.
If I could make one, and on reflection, obvious point in a way that lots of people, their way of doing good in the world is their work, is their vocation. The NHS is still, I think, the largest employer in Europe and one of the largest employers in the world. It ranks alongside, kind of the Chinese army, and it's that kind of scale of employer. And lots of people go to work in the NHS because they are motivated to towards a common good. And that is, of course, and I don't actually think it's right to kind of necessarily draw an arbitrary distinction in that sense. I know lots of people who work for a kind of private sector employer, yet that is still their way of serving other people and connecting with other people and doing well by other people. It makes me think of Jesus. Jesus, of course, doesn't want his disciples to work. He says, look at the birds of the air, they don't bother, you shouldn't. But he also says, I'm with you as one who serves. So it's very much about kind of serving the people around him. Like that, it's a big part of what I'm trying to get. It's a big part of most people's motivation, whatever they do, is to do well by the people around them.
I might just add to that, because I think a very interesting part of in the report is also in which we haven't really, and which Barbara mentioned, is the volunteering aspect of things as well. Now, I don't think volunteering should be a replacement for rewarding work, and engagement and feeling of belonging and community and so on. But actually, you know, you can all that there are lots of people out there who are doing volunteering, which similarly gives them that meaning. And I think increasingly, again, enlightened employers are recognizing the report talks about tokenism in volunteering, saying, oh, well, we'll give you a few hours off to go off and work in some community project. But again, I think, you know, the marketplace is we recently have been, the note's gone around, we get volunteering hours to do whatever volunteering it is that, you know, we want to do. And we've had a note round recently saying, look, please log your volunteering hours, because we want to be able to tell the world about the volunteering that we're doing. So, you know, there is a market, and, you know, more and more as we're doing, you know, we're tendering for work, we're being asked questions, not just, I mean, both actually about being authentic, because we're being pushed into investing in ethical ways, but then people, social ESG ways, people are then saying to us, but we want authenticity in the way that you behave. So, I mean, I suppose it also fits in with some of the discussion about how do you get the market pressures working here? How do you get customers? How do you get clients? How do we behave in such a way that it puts pressure on the businesses that we're interacting with?
Thanks, Sheila. Now, Pepita has put an interesting question in the chat box, and perhaps if you can come off mute now, I think, and put it to the panel. Pepita, thank you. About loyalty not just in the big organization, but in the smaller ones. Are you able to speak to us? Don't worry about background noise at home. That's that's the way we are these days. Please, I can read it out for you if you prefer, if I paraphrase you. And I'm watching you, so nod or shake your head if I'm getting it wrong. So Barbara touched upon the kind of the commitment, the obligation, in a sense, of the employer to show some loyalty to employees and invest in their future and so on. But Pepita puts it from the other end of the telescope, if you like, small and medium-sized enterprises, perhaps very few employees, and a concern that, I mean, the classic fear of employers that, and perhaps particularly among younger workers, that they're mobile, they're not going to stay forever. And so this tension about the loyalty due from the employee to the employer, if that, I think I'm understanding Pepita's point. Of course, in the parallel is the Health and Safety at Work Act, where the employer has a duty of care to the employee. So too does the employee have a duty of care for him and herself and for each other at work. So it's sort of the two-way loyalty question, in short.
And I think the reason I'm so fascinated by this question is I have lived this question as both an employee and an employer. And I think it's a gigantic question of chicken and egg, because I think employees became less loyal because employers became less loyal, and they stopped training their staff. And so in order to get new experience and new learning, the staff had to go somewhere else. And I watched it. I'm probably tell by my white hair, I'm probably older than you are, but I worked for a major US bank that started firing people whenever the profits went down. And so they were no longer loyal to us. They stopped their training program because they claimed too many people were leaving. Well, they were firing most of them. Many people were not leaving voluntarily. And then they were saying we were not loyal. And it was really, really annoying to watch this change occur. And now they, and then they struggled for years to keep staff because everybody realized it was a one-sided bargain. Now, I recognize that's much harder in small and medium-sized companies, and I'm not quite sure what you do. And what we've engendered is an entire generation who think you're a loser if you work more than 3 years in any one job, because I happen to have, my daughter's partner is one of those people. And he changes jobs every 3 years because nobody would stay more than 3 years. You've used them up. You've learned everything.
Not wives, Barbara, not wives.
you've used up your job in that much time and learned what you could, and it's time to go on. So it only works if both sides of the bargain work. You have to invest in the staff, and the staff have to recognize that you invest in them. Now, I'm now on the board of a bank where the average tenure is over 20 years because they do that. So I think employees understand whether you're taking care of them or not, and how, and maybe a discussion with them about what you need to do or what they want. And if they're going to leave anyway, then you may be absolutely right.
It's a reminder about what we sometimes call wicked issues in the policy world, isn't it? If you go back to 1963 and the speech given in Scarborough by someone called Harold Wilson, which contained a famous phrase about the white heat of technology. Another issue he touched upon in that speech was this so-called, I believe the phrase that used to be used was the so-called freeloader problem, but this nervousness among employers about investment in training, investment in people that then is lost because people move on. Some of these questions never go away. Now for some better news, Simon Surtees has asked a nice, constructive, helpful question. Can we have some examples of businesses and organizations that are doing something to humanize work? Anyone on the panel would like to say something nice about an employer that's doing something good?
Well, our favorite example is Clean for Good. I'm not sure if Tim is with us today, Tim Thornton, but Clean for Good is a cleaning company. It's a limited company. It's not a CIO or anything like that. Its intention is to transform the cleaning industry by being a kind of demonstration of how it can be done with a combination of good management. One of the problems in the cleaning industry is that margins are obviously often kind of people fight for margin by firing middle management, so that a cleaner might never meet anybody from their kind of management team. They just get these messages to go here and there. Of course, wage, also language support, where people actually might be quite highly skilled in their kind of place of origin, but here in the UK they don't have the language support or qualifications to work in their to use their skills to the fullest. They're a great example of. I mean, Tim would say, and I think does say all the time, that they can't compete on price. They are a more expensive option, but they can compete on story. So that their story and that what they're doing is infinitely more powerful. They're not just kind of cleaning buildings, but they're kind of building up people and giving people security as well. And living hours is a big part of what they do as well. So predictable hours. So that's a great example at a small level, or relatively small level. I think there are examples further up the kind of size scale as well. One of the people we had speaking at the round table was an HR representative from Unilever, and they were telling us about some of the decisions that they'd made about starting new businesses in areas where they knew they were going to have to pull out and close particular plants or facilities that was not economically viable. But rather than just kind of a kind of scorched earth policy, they were working with people to start new businesses so that they weren't the only alternative in a particular place and a particular location. So I think there are good examples, and I agree with Sheila actually that like a well-motivated business is a powerful influence for good, and well-motivated leaders are a powerful influence for good. It's not that everything can be fixed by regulation. And I think there are good stories, and other people might have other stories as well.
Thanks. Well, Ian Geary, our birthday boy, come off mute and put your point about automation and the political choices that government's going to have to make about automation.
Okay, thinking that there's no I'd rather be on my birthday than having this discussion. So, people, I mean that, people know that. So, John Cruddas must read The Dignity of Labour by John Cruddas, which is quite closely aligned to the topic. Seems to infers that the potential threat of to the labour market from automation ultimately is possibly a matter of political choice. So to what degree do some of the things we're talking about humanising labour work how are they going to be resolved or addressed through political means and political programs? To all the panel, thank you.
Why don't I take a first stab, because we can use an example that we actually have in the pamphlet, which is DEFRA setting up innovation funds to try and come up with automation tech innovation in agriculture. And their intention is to have fewer employees in the future, it's true, but better paid and non-seasonal employees. So you get actually a higher quality, better paid workforce out of this, and you are less reliant on seasonal workers. Now, if you're a seasonal worker that makes your money that way, that's a bit of a problem. So in all technological shifts, there are winners and losers. And they always require adaptation. And one of the reasons training was so big in our agenda is we believe this technological change will require many people to be retrained into new kinds of jobs. I mean, as the most obvious example, I always feel bad for the checkout clerks who are showing me how to use the automated tills. And on a bad day, I will say, do you realize you're putting yourself out of a job by teaching me how to do this? And yet, you know, they do, because they need the pay from teaching me how to do it. So I think there are ways to do it better and there are ways to do it worse. And the question is, and I think the crux of your question is, how do we put the pressure on to do it better, the tech for good, instead of making these really, truly unpleasant jobs for people where they are working and just doing a task repetitively. And so automating that instead of automating something else. And I frankly don't have an answer. I'm kind of hoping Andrew will.
Well, I think there's some good points in there, but you know, we say it's technology and automation, but the means of production has changed consistently through our capital model. Yeah, and you know, we deal with it in our membership a lot around the energy sector. Yeah, and actually the biggest example of job transition in the UK, I think, has been in the energy sector, and we've handled it badly. You know, so I think there does need to be leadership from companies, but we equally need what we would call a just transition as people move from the old green economies into the new economies. We need exactly the same kind of just transition into how technology is working. I'll give you another example of retail workers. So supermarkets, a brilliant report called the Amazonian Era, which is looking at how lots of this technology developed in warehousing is transferring into other jobs. So some supermarket chains now have heat sensors on the till areas, which sounds great to me as a consumer, because what it says is if there's a queue, they know to put more staff on to serve me, because I like to be served by a person rather than machine, generally because I can't work the machine, but I also like it as well. Now that sounds brilliant, because I'm also a modern person who gets impatient waiting. So I get a better service because they know when to put staff out. What it doesn't tell you is the other half of that is they also measure the productivity of staff by how long the queues are and what the heat sensor does. So they use the data from the heat sensor to say, do you know what, Stefan, you take much longer serving people on the till than your neighbours do, with no consideration of whether you are dealing with customers who want to ask questions, whether it's me not able to find my loyalty card and taking a bit longer than average because I can't remember what pocket I put in it, or whether someone has an ability issue or other issue that needs some help with around it. You turn, you know, this datafication of human labor into data points, which can then be used for performance management, is the dystopian end of this market that we're talking about. And it's largely coming from economies outside Europe, because we do have some data rights in the UK, but we shouldn't underestimate the ability of this. You know, this is about big tech and big companies. Technology is just the medium. You know, we have examples where technology can really help people. We also know that things that sound good to us as consumers can also have an end it. So how do we get that just transition? And I think where this links to that whole big debate about society as a whole is people are not stupid. So it is about quality jobs and quality of life. So people in traditional economic areas who have seen decent jobs, apprenticeships and things for their kids go and be replaced by warehousing or 0 hours work know they've been given a bum deal in the economy. And you look at the parts of the country where there is disconnection from our political system and and the debates that happen in Westminster, work runs through that, the dignity and respect people have. And my challenge back to everyone on this is, how do we make sure we do better in this next technological revolution than we have done in the last ones? Because we've alienated people and we've created disruption in our society, which has a long tail because we didn't center the human experience in the way our economic model changed.
And Andrew, what power, I want to put Tim Yearsley's question back to you really. I mean, what power do workers have to try and humanize their own work and their own experience of work? And Tim, do come off mute if I've garbled your question there.
Is that a good summary, Tim? Did you want to come in?
He's given me the benefit of the doubt.
Well, look, workers need to organise, and I can see colleagues from CWU and other unions on this call who are making agreements and negotiating and campaigning in workspaces. And actually, the really good thing of coming out of this next period of the economy is we know many employers want to get this right. So Sheila is absolutely right. There are some brilliant employers out there who are involving their workers and unions to try and come up with solutions that satisfy the need for greater flexibility. But we know that's not enough. So we've just done the first ever training for us as a union in data right, bargaining over data, because we do have rights under GDPR over privacy. So we are challenging companies which are seeking to bring inappropriate technology into workspaces, and we're using the law that exists. But what we know about AI and the new technology, what we know about things like the right to disconnect is there has to be some national framework for it. And I'm really happy for it to be a nudge framework. It doesn't have to be, big sweaty hands regulation. It needs to be modern economy regulation. But technology is making decisions about our lives, about whether we are good workers or bad workers, about whether we get promoted or not, about the kinds of workers who are datafied, and we need to put some human oversight into that. And to me, that's the real big challenge. How do we humanize or reassert human values? And it does require some legislation. Europe's looking at it, the UK needs to look at it, build on what we have over things like GDPR, but actually create a set of labour laws, because essentially we have a set of equality laws, employment laws, health and safety laws, which were designed in the last century around the concept of physical harm and workspaces. We're now moving into a world where the harm can be done by discrimination in an AI system that no one knows and no one can see how it works. So I'm really interested in, what does a future of regulation, a future of protection and safety look like in a world we can't really see because it's out of sight and out of mind? That to me is the real great challenge in this.
Yeah. That's a great point, and we need another hour and a half for that one, but it's a really excellent point. A very nice sort of theoretical, almost an economist's question from Nicholas Erian, and again, I'll try and summarize it as best I can, which is simply this: is a worker worth more or less, or roughly the same, when they're working from home? Who has a thought on that?
I think the data shows that they work longer at home. Which is, I think, an interesting point, that people took that extra margin. This is ONS data. They took that extra margin that they got back from getting on trains or sitting in cars in traffic jams on the way to work, and they basically worked longer, which just goes to show that it's not always about the employer. Sometimes it's about, well, I think sometimes we're internal motivation to probably work too hard, and we need to pay attention to that individual's kind of psychological aspect as well. But the other thing that we forget is, I do think we need a new framework. So of course, in France during the pandemic, they had to shift their regulatory framework because they had legislation against people, what was it, eating at their desks, because their desks became their
serious crime in France. Serious crime.
It is indeed, yeah. So they had to change that because, of course, lots of people's desks became their kitchen tables, and that. But it's a trite example, but it's about that severing of link between place and work and time, and that all flowing very differently. And therefore, we need to think again about what we, how we protect people who are working in a completely different way. As Andrew said earlier, of course, it's right that we acknowledge that's only part of the workforce, but that is a substantial part of the workforce. We need a kind of set of protections that fit their circumstance. But I get the impression the question was slightly tongue-in-cheek. Because workers are worth the same wherever they're working. That's probably the right answer. But I do think we need to think differently about how we protect them when they are working from home.
Of course, also tongue in cheek. There was a Bartleby column in The Economist, which I'm a big fan of, which is about management and work, which said we're all much more productive because the frivolous meetings that exist in most offices have been discontinued because people just don't attend now on Zoom, or they do other things if they're not useful. So we're all much more productive from home in the white collar world than we would be in the office.
Well, maybe. I commend to you also Polita Clark's column in the FT yesterday, where she said there's the mixed picture about, as Paul was hinting, longer hours without greater output. So it's very much a mixed picture. And the point about worth is really important because, as you know, there were some rumblings from Silicon Valley, I think Facebook and others, where the algorithms come from, about how since people had been downshifting or downsizing or moving to cheaper accommodation because they could work remotely, that some firms were beginning to talk about cutting pay because they said, well, you're living somewhere much cheaper now, so we don't have to pay. I don't think anything came of it. It was an outrage, but you can see where some of this thinking can take you. We're just down to our last couple of minutes. Any last minute thoughts from anyone on the panel before we wrap up on time at half?
I just wanted to come back to Ian's question about how does this fit into a kind of political program or political change? This may be to kind of disappear slightly off piste, but it strikes me that part of that's about making sure that there is a broad conversation, and it involves voices from civil society as well, including churches. As Andrew was saying earlier, they have a lot to say and want to contribute to it. It does seem to me that the kind of social and political engagement from churches over the last couple of decades we've gone a bit silent on work. We've gone a bit quiet on work. We've rightly talked a lot about those people who are not in work, the unemployed, and how they're supported or fail in many cases to be supported. But I think there is a case for a kind of broader conversation, and for churches to become more vocal on this situation. People in the pews, what's their experience of the work? And after all, I think, is it right? Is it 30 million people in work in the UK? It's a majority concern. Most people will have of it and want to talk about it. Are we talking about what they're talking about? That would just be a thought.
That's a very good challenge, Paul, to end with. And you and Barbara have brilliantly provided the reading material and the ammunition, if you like, secular, peaceful ammunition, intellectual ammunition to have this debate. Thank you also to Sheila for your thoughts and contribution, and Andrew. Thanks to all of you for staying loyally to the end. This may have been work, but I hope it was also enjoyable work and productive work. Thanks, of course, to Theos for hosting it. They'll be sending you a copy of the paper and other communication, and perhaps a link to this recording on YouTube if you feel the need to watch it again, and perhaps you will. But in the meantime, keep cool if you can in this weather. Thanks for spending the time with us this afternoon, and good afternoon to you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.